The hangar carried the restless hum of pre-dawn, a place alive with echoes of voices and the scrape of boots on concrete. Yellow floodlights spilled long shadows across the tarmac, their glow cutting through a haze of fuel vapor that clung to the morning air. Inside, mechanics moved like silhouettes between open panels. The smell of oil and metal, sharp enough to sting the nose. Pilots leaned in clusters, voices carrying in low banter, every laugh bouncing against the corrugated walls, as though the building itself joined in. It was not cruel. Not quite. But there was a knowing edge to their amusement, and it always found its mark. Lieutenant Claire Ardon walked through it all, with her helmet tucked under one arm. The name embroidered on her patch looked fresh, the stitching still too bright compared to the faded threads on the veterans who lounged nearby. One of them lifted his chin and grinned as she passed. "Falcon 12, he said with a chuckle that carried. "Sounds like something a kid would paint on a model jet." Another added that it was a cute name for a crash report. The laughter that followed rolled through the hangar like a wave. Claire did not stop walking. She did not even look at them. Her face was still, the same calm she had practiced in mirrors since the day she first earned her wings. But inside, her stomach turned in slow knots. She heard every word, every smirk pressed against her back like weight. At her aircraft, the silence thickened. The jet's fuselage glistened faintly under the lights, sleek and ready. A machine that asked for nothing but discipline. Claire set her helmet down on the wing root and climbed the ladder. Her boots found each rung with precision. She strapped in, pulling the harness across her chest, the webbing digging into her flight suit. Her hands trembled for a moment as she clicked the buckle. A tiny betrayal hidden by the shadows of the cockpit. She forced her breath steady. One inhale. One exhale. Slow enough to quiet the shake. This was her ritual. To the harness. A reminder that restraint was as much a weapon as speed. The chatter behind her lingered even after the canopy closed. She could almost hear it through the glass. Muffled, but sharp in memory. Falcon 12. A call sign that sounded to them like a joke. She pressed her palms once against the stick and throttle, feeling the cold of the controls seep into her gloves. The noise in her head began to fade, replaced by the steady whine of the auxiliary power unit spinning to life. Machines had no opinions. They demanded only action. And action was what she had come to give. The operations officer's voice cracked over the radio, flat and professional. "Rogue signals have been noted in your corridor. Could be interference. Could be worse." Claire absorbed the words with a brief pause, the weight of them heavier than the ridicule she had endured minutes before. This was no longer about a name painted on a roster. This was about her ability to hold steady when the sky itself seemed ready to test her. She responded with clipped acknowledgement, her voice steady, giving nothing away. Her canopy reflected the hangar lights, twin circles glowing above her like eyes that waited to see if she would stumble. She closed her own eyes for a heartbeat, drawing a line between the noise of others and the silence she chose for herself. The mockery was still there, but it no longer burned. It became fuel, hidden deep, waiting to be turned into something they could not laugh at. Outside, the hangar bustled on, pilots trading stories of past missions, laughter echoing again. Inside her cockpit, Claire sat in stillness, her hands now calm, her breath measured, the weight of expectation pressed down on her shoulders, but she carried it without complaint. Respect was not given at the start. It would come, if it came at all, only after the silence of the sky bore witness. The engine's roar built into a steady thunder that swallowed the hangar and everything inside it. Claire guided the jet forward with small, precise motions, the nose wheel following the painted lines across the wet concrete. The canopy vibrated faintly with each surge of thrust, the glass catching reflections of yellow floodlights as she taxied toward the runway, her helmet pressed tight against her temples, sealing her into the cocoon of the cockpit. Outside, the voices that had mocked her call sign still rang in her memory. Falcon 12. A toy plane. A crash report in waiting. She could not shake them. Not yet. They clung to her even as she performed final checks. Fuel steady. Hydraulics green. Avionics stable. Her mouth was dry. But her voice came calm as she spoke into the mic, requesting clearance. The tower gave permission, and the runway stretched ahead like a strip of black glass. Claire eased the throttle forward. Engines surged into a full-throated roar, the jet trembling under her as it gathered speed. The runway lights rushed beneath, shrinking one by one until the entire airfield blurred into streaks of white. Her body pressed back into the seat as the aircraft lifted, weight pulling free of Earth. In a single breath, the world beneath her fell away. The base lights dimmed into a cluster of yellow stars, and the sky opened in a vault of black coldness. Inside the cockpit, she felt the transition most in her ears. The laughter she had carried out of the hangar dissolved into silence, but silence was not comfort. It was a pressure that reminded her she was alone now. No voices but her own. The instruments flickered once. Then again, a pulse of static hissed in her headset. The radar pinged something faint, then went dark. She frowned and adjusted gain. But the scope stayed clean. Ghost signal, she thought. Or something worse. Her throat tightened. She tried to focus on the basics. Horizon steady. Climb rate nominal. Speed within tolerance. But her mind slipped back to those veterans in the hangar, their arms folded, waiting for her to prove their laughter right. She could almost hear them chuckling in the static. Falcon 12. What a name to go down with. She shook her head as if she could scatter the thought like dust. Courage did not mean the absence of fear. It meant carrying fear into the sky and answering anyway. At the tower, a different silence had begun to take hold. A cluster of pilots gathered behind the controllers, their reflections caught in the tall glass panes. They leaned closer to the glowing radar screen, eyes fixed on a single green blip that traced Claire's climb. Some smirked still, whispering among themselves, but their voices carried less weight than before. Every flicker on that screen, every unstable return, made their laughter feel thinner. The room carried its own tension, the kind that grows when people expect to see proof of failure. The instruments flickered again, warning lights flashing, then fading. Claire steadied her breathing and tightened her grip on the stick. This was what she had trained for. Not the perfect skies of simulations. Not the practice drills where nothing failed. But the moment when technology faltered and the pilot's own calm became the only anchor. Her hands trembled once, then stilled. She could feel her heart pounding against the harness strap. She whispered a checklist line under her breath, more to quiet her nerves than to confirm data. Outside the canopy, stars shimmered faint and distant. The horizon was a smear of gray where dawn would eventually come. For now, it was all darkness and silence, broken only by the hiss of interference in her headset. The call sign Falcon 12 echoed again in her memory, but now it sounded different, less like mockery and more like a challenge. She pressed her throttle forward and let the jet climb into the blackness, determined to answer it. The reconnaissance corridor stretched ahead like a hollowed tunnel in the sky, dark and unstable. Carved by invisible currents of wind that shifted without warning, Claire adjusted her trim and scanned her instruments. The hum of the jet steady for the moment. Outside, jagged banks of cloud lined the horizon like serrated teeth. Pockets of turbulence lurked between them. Waiting. Her radar screen flickered. A thin return sweeping across with a half-formed signal that vanished as quickly as it came. A hiss filled her headset, static curling at the edges like whispers just beyond comprehension. She told herself it was interference, the sort that rattled rookies but meant nothing. Still, she tightened her grip on the stick and leaned forward as though bracing against something she could not yet see. The first strike came sudden. A jolt seized the right wing, the jet tipping violently into a dive. Claire's body slammed against her harness as gravity shifted. The cockpit tilted, sky and ground spinning in a blur. Alarms wailed, and her breath caught hard in her throat. She forced her hands steady, fighting the urge to yank the stick too sharply. With controlled force, she pulled back, countering the roll. Muscles straining in her shoulders and arms, the jet groaned as if resisting her. Then leveled just above the low bank of cloud. Her chest heaved, breath ragged. But her hands stayed fixed. Her training whispered through the adrenaline. Correct. Stabilize. Breathe. Her eyes swept the instruments. Then the scope. A faint blip shimmered on the edge of detection, moving irregularly before fading again. She frowned, adjusted gain, and scanned the terrain below. Between shifting clouds and shadow, something emerged. A Fuselage. Barely visible, angled against the darkness. The beacon was cold, the signal broken. At first it seemed like debris, another husk left in contested air. Then the glint of glass caught her eye. Through the canopy she spotted faint movement. She magnified her scope, and the image sharpened. 3 figures pressed against the cockpit glass, their gestures desperate, their faces obscured but unmistakably human. The sight hit harder than the dive had. Orders came back to her with precision. Recon only. No deviation. Stay invisible. She was meant to record, not intervene. Her hand hovered over the comm switch, then fell away. The crew below had no beacon, no way to call for help. Without her, they were invisible. And in this airspace, invisible meant doomed. Claire swallowed hard, her pulse hammering. Protocol was clear. Her conscience was not. She steadied the jet again, circling at a careful distance. The figures remained at the glass, small shapes against the shadows. Reminding her of how fragile life looked from altitude, her hands trembled once on the stick. But she kept them there, refusing to let go. Every second she lingered increased the risk of detection. Every second she hesitated meant the crew below slipped closer to being lost for good. The static in her headset rose again, curling around her thoughts like whispers. Falcon 12. The echo of ridicule seemed to say, "What will you answer now?" she breathed in. Then out. And let the question settle. The damaged beacon glowed faintly in her sight. A mute cry for help. Her training told her to stay on course. Her humanity told her otherwise. For the first time since leaving the runway, Claire realized this flight would not be measured by checklists or simulations. It would be measured by the choice she made here. Circling above 3 lives, trapped in silence. The corridor stretched ahead, waiting. But she no longer cared for its safe path. The true test had already arrived, hidden in shadow. Pressing its hands against the glass of a stranded craft, Claire's decision came without fanfare. She pushed the stick hard to the left and felt the jet roll sharply. The G-forces, pressing her back into the seat until her ribs ached. The nose dipped, angling toward the roiling wall of cloud ahead. Her breath caught, but her grip held steady. The storm front loomed like a living barrier, black and restless, lightning twitching within its depths. She knew what the manual said: stay clear, do not enter, recon only. Yet her course cut directly for it, leaving behind the assigned corridor and every protocol tethering her to safety. In the control tower, the sudden deviation was unmistakable. A controller leaned forward over the glowing screen, eyes wide. The single green blip that marked her jet veered sharply off its predicted line. Headsets crackled with overlapping voices. She is off course. Repeat. Falcon 12 is breaking route. The room filled with noise as more pilots crowded closer. Drawn by the sudden anomaly, some muttered that she had lost her nerve. That turbulence had shoved her off balance. But the controllers knew better. The maneuver was deliberate, decisive, a clean cut across the airspace. Inside her cockpit, Claire switched to the secure channel. Her words clipped and urgent. Possible down supply craft at grid 317. Transmitting coordinates now. Her voice cut through with forced calm. every syllable pressed flat by discipline. Static clawed at the message. Fragments lost to interference. She repeated the coordinates, forcing them through again. Sweat ran down her temple beneath the helmet. She adjusted gain, her thumb firm on the switch. 317. Repeat. Cold beacon. Visual on survivors. Then the hiss rose, swallowing half the sentence. Below, the stranded aircraft sat in shadows, metal glinting faint beneath the storm's dim light. Through the canopy glass she saw them again, 3 figures pressed against the window. Their movements were frantic but blurred by distance and weather, arms lifting and falling as if begging the sky itself to notice. Claire steadied her breathing, eyes locked on them, for as long as her orbit allowed. She tightened her harness and banked low again, unwilling to lose sight even as the turbulence jarred her teeth. Back at the tower, the transmission sputtered across their channels. Fragments of her report broke through like shards of glass in a stream of static. Possible downed survivors. Grid 317. Controllers scrambled to match the fragments, plotting coordinates onto maps. Rescue pilots snapped to readiness. Rotor crews firing up engines, yet the uncertainty gnawed at them. The signal was fading. And with it, the lifeline. Claire forced her voice louder, as though sheer will could punch through the interference. Survivors in hostile zone, dispatch choppers now. She could hear her own words breaking apart in the static, pieces scattering like ash. But she did not stop. Over and over, she pressed the switch, repeating the grid, driving it into the ether until someone caught it. Lightning cracked nearby, a violent flash that lit the stranded craft below for a heartbeat. The figures at the glass were illuminated in stark relief, human faces drawn tight with fear and hope, then swallowed back into darkness. Claire gritted her teeth, her hands steady on the stick despite the tremor in her arms. She knew her signal would die entirely once she cut deeper into the storm. But the message was out now. Carried on whatever fragments made it through, her radar showed the faint trace of chopper units beginning to vector toward the grid. Relief mixed with dread. She had bought them a chance, though it might cost her everything. Protocol was broken. Orders ignored. She was alone now, heading into a storm that did not forgive. Yet she felt no regret. Courage, she realized, was not in staying quiet. It was in breaking the silence when lives hung in it. The storm closed around Claire like a living thing. One moment, the sky was open darkness. The next, it was walls of black cloud, pressing tight against her canopy. Rain lashed hard across the glass. The sound like handfuls of gravel thrown by invisible hands. Turbulence struck from below and above at once, lifting the jet only to slam it back down in the next heartbeat. Her harness dug deep into her shoulders as the aircraft shook. The stick quivered in her grip, alive with resistance, demanding constant correction. Lightning cracked through the clouds, and for an instant the cockpit glowed white, shadows leaping across her helmet. The thunder followed with bone-rattling force, vibrating through the fuselage. Claire exhaled slow, forcing her breathing steady. Altitude 3,000. Speed 280. She muttered the numbers aloud, her voice calm, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Sweat beaded along her forehead under the helmet, slipping down her cheek and stinging her eyes. The instruments flickered, green digits dimming, warning lights winking in and out. The artificial horizon rolled for a moment before recovering, then shivered as static crawled across the screen. Claire tapped the gauge with a gloved finger, a habit as old as her training. Though she knew the fault was not mechanical, but atmospheric, she ran through her checklist in a low murmur. Power steady, hydraulics responsive, airframe holding. Her voice kept her centered, a rhythm against the chaos. Outside, the storm gave nothing but violence. The jet pitched hard left, and she countered, muscles burning in her arms. The nose dropped again, gravity pressing heavy into her chest. before she wrestled it level. Every mile was earned, not flown. The storm was not something to escape, but something to endure. And endurance came in seconds strung together, each one harder than the last. At the tower, the glass panes shook faintly with each thunderclap. Controllers leaned close to the radar screens, the lone blip jittering across its trace. Around them, the same veterans who had laughed earlier stood in silence. Their reflections wavered in the windows, faces pale as lightning flickered outside. One muttered under his breath, a sound too quiet to be a joke. They watched the blip stutter, vanish for a half second, then return. No one laughed now. The silence grew heavier with every pulse. Back in the cockpit, the ice warning light blinked. A sheen began to creep across the wing edges, catching in the strobe flashes. Claire adjusted her angle of attack, shuddering as she fought to keep lift alive. Her jaw clenched, teeth grinding as she pressed her knee harder against the rudder pedal. Her shoulders ached with the strain of constant corrections. Her hands trembled once, then stilled as she forced them calm. Control was discipline. Discipline was survival. She recited again. Altitude holding. Speed steady. The words came like prayer, not for anyone listening, but for herself. The storm had stripped everything else away. No hangar laughter. No call sign mockery. Only her voice and the machine she held in place. Each flash of lightning lit the cabin with harsh brilliance, showing her face drawn with fatigue, but her eyes fixed forward. The jet fought. The storm raged. But Claire endured, mille after mille. She pressed through walls of cloud that seemed endless. In the tower, the veterans said nothing. Their silence was no longer dismissive. It was respect. Unspoken. Forged by the simple fact that she was still there. Still moving. Still alive inside a storm that had broken better pilots. The return leg was worse than the climb in. The storm had swallowed the horizon whole, leaving Claire inside a shifting cage of black water and white fire. Every control surface trembled with stress. Warning lights blinked and died, then returned without rhythm. The altimeter wavered, digits sliding back and forth like a loose compass needle. The canopy edges hissed as ice scraped across the frame, thin sheets cracking away only to reform seconds later. Claire steadied her breathing. Each inhale counted. Each exhale deliberate. She whispered through the checklist again, voice hoarse inside the helmet. Hydraulics holding. Throttle response steady. Wings carrying. She knew half of it was untrue, but saying the words kept her mind locked to procedure rather than panic. The comm line was nothing but static now. She was alone with the machine, flying on discipline and instinct. Her arms shook from strain. Shoulders pressed hard into the seat as she fought the stick against gusts that wanted to tear it free. Every correction demanded muscle and precision. She shifted her grip on the throttle, hand slick with sweat. When lightning lit the cabin, her reflection stared back at her from the canopy, pale and taut, eyes burning with fatigue but refusing to close. Minutes stretched into an hour. The storm showing no mercy. The jet rattled like a tin shell about to come apart. Yet still, in the distance, a faint glow appeared through the sheeting rain. Two specks of light, trembling in the shifting wind. Runway lights. Claire blinked hard. As though afraid they were illusion, she angled toward them, whispering again to herself, hold steady. Almost there. The descent was chaos. Crosswinds slammed her side, rolling the jet until the wing nearly clipped cloud top. She corrected, jaw clenched, muttering through the sequence. Flaps down, gear down, approach vector confirmed. The systems barely responded. The left gear indicator flickered, then steadied green. She trusted it, because there was no choice. The runway widened below, shining slick under floodlights. Rain, turning the strip into a mirror. She crossed the threshold too fast. Wind tearing at the fuselage. The jet hit hard, bouncing once, tires skidding on water before gripping. The brakes screamed, the fuselage shuddering like it would split. Claire pressed harder, muscle locked, the stick quivering in her grip. Hydroplaning dragged her half off centerline before she corrected with a sharp rudder kick. The nose dipped, then steadied, brakes shrieking until finally the momentum died. The jet lurched once, then came to stillness, in a haze of steam and rain. Inside the cockpit, Claire sat motionless for a breath. Her hands remained locked to stick and throttle, as though she could not let go. Her chest rose and fell in shallow bursts, each breath scraping her throat. She blinked sweat and rain from her lashes, whispering again, "Aircraft down safe. Aircraft down safe." Only then did she release the controls and let her arms fall limp against the harness. In the tower, silence reigned. The radar showed her blip safe on the strip. Controllers stood frozen, headsets loose around their necks. Veterans who had grinned at her call sign stared wordless at the glowing runway, their reflections caught in the glass as lightning still flashed behind them. No one spoke, because there was nothing to say. They had expected failure. Instead, they had witnessed survival forged at the edge of collapse. On the rain-slick runway, Claire exhaled and rested her helmeted head against the seat. No glory surged in her chest, not triumph, only the fragile relief of still being alive. The hardest victories, she knew now, were not marked in celebration, but in the thin line between wreckage and return. When survival itself was the only reward, the rain had softened to a mist by the time Claire's jet taxied toward the hangar. The tarmac glistened under floodlights, slick and gleaming as though the entire airfield had been polished by the storm. Steam curled from the exhaust as she slowed to a halt, the engine spooling down in a fading roar. Her body ached from the fight, every muscle stretched past exhaustion. Yet her posture remained upright. She unlatched her harness with deliberate calm, the webbing releasing from her chest with a soft snap. For a moment she stayed inside the cockpit, hands resting still on the controls, before she pushed the canopy open and let the wet air rush in. The hangar doors yawned wide, light spilling out onto the strip. A line of pilots stood just beyond, their boots forming a straight edge along the concrete. Where laughter had once filled the space, now there was silence so deep she could hear the dripping of rainwater from the roof. Their faces were drawn with fatigue and something heavier acknowledgement that no one dared put into words too quickly. Claire climbed down the ladder slowly, boots striking the rungs with dull thuds. Each sound echoed in the hangar, magnified by the absence of banter. She walked across the slick surface toward them. Helmet zuckte unter her Arm. Floodlight glare caught the sheen of water on her flight suit, highlighting each crease, each patch of scuff where the harness had pressed against her for hours. Her steps were steady, measured. She carried herself as though the storm had taken nothing, though in truth it had drained her to the bone. The pilots watched in stillness, eyes tracking her every movement. At the front of the line stood the man who had been loudest in his mockery that morning. His grin was gone. His expression was drawn, conflicted, the weight of what he had seen pressing his jaw tight. As she stopped before him, he lifted his hand in a sharp salute. The gesture cut through the silence, crisp and clear, a line drawn between what had been said before and what could never be taken back. His voice followed, quieter than his laughter had been, yet carrying far more weight. Good flying. Falcon. The call sign hung in the air, transformed. Once a joke, now a title spoken with the gravity of respect. The others lifted their hands in unison. A wall of salutes held steady in the floodlight glow. Claire stood still, helmet at her side, returning the salute with quiet precision. She did not smile, did not gloat, did not seek more than the moment itself. The respect was enough, earned not by words, but by the storm she had endured and returned from. The silence deepened. It was not empty, but full, heavy with unspoken recognition. The hangar that had echoed with mockery now bore witness to something different. A collective shift that needed no explanation. Claire lowered her hand and inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the gesture without breaking her composed stillness. Inside, fatigue pressed hard. Yet beneath it, a thread of pride ran steady. Not pride in triumph, but in having carried through when everything urged her to fail. Around them, the storm still muttered at the horizon. Thunder faint in the distance. The air smelled of wet asphalt and jet fuel, a sharp mix that clung to the night. Claire drew in a slow breath and released it, shoulders easing at last. Falcon 12 no longer sounded like a child's name painted on a toy jet. It sounded like something forged in fire and storm, spoken by those who now understood. Real respect, she realized, was not given before the mission. It arrived in silence afterward, when truth could not be denied. In the days that followed, the storm was still spoken of in the hangar. Though no one framed it as weather alone, the rookies heard it first in passing, whispered from veteran to veteran in tones different from the laughter they once used. They spoke of the night Falcon 12 had gone off course, of the radar blip that had nearly vanished in the storm and returned against all odds. No one recounted the story with embellishment. They did not need to. The silence that had hung in the tower that night was enough proof for any who had stood there. New recruits arriving before dawn caught fragments of the tale between fuel checks and equipment briefings. They were told not to underestimate the storm corridor, not to dismiss the quiet pilot whose call sign had once been a joke. They learned quickly that Falcon 12 no longer meant mockery. It carried weight, the kind of weight born not from ceremony or metal, but from endurance that could not be denied. The name had become something passed in whispers, like a warning and an inspiration at once. The tower staff remembered too. They recalled the lightning flashes reflected in the glass, the silence when her blip faltered, and the collective breath. They all held until it landed safe. Some carried the memory with unease, knowing they had expected to see her fail. Others carried it with respect, grateful they had been present to witness something that would echo far longer than an entry in any logbook. Claire herself spoke little of it. She moved through the routines with steady calm, helmet under one arm, hands methodical as she checked her jet. The harness clicked into place across her chest, the familiar restraint grounding her as always. She did not seek the glances that followed her now, nor did she dwell on what they meant. The sky was calling again, and she knew the only answer that mattered was to fly. When she stood on the tarmac in the pale light of another dawn, the air felt different. Once the sky had seemed cold, a silent judge waiting for her to falter. Now it carried something else. As though the storm itself had granted a kind of acknowledgement, the clouds above moved slowly, calm for now. Yet holding memory of what she had endured, Claire breathed deep, steadying her pulse. Courage was not in the sound of her name, mocked or honored. It was in the act of answering when fear told her to remain silent. Pilots still used her call sign. They called her Falcon 12 over comms, sometimes with careful neutrality, sometimes with quiet respect. The sound had shifted permanently. It was no longer the joke of a rookie. It was a reminder of what the storm had demanded and what she had given in return. Claire did not correct them, nor did she hold on to pride. The name was not what mattered. What mattered was what it carried now. As she walked toward her aircraft once more, rookies paused to watch. Veterans fell silent in her path, not in mockery but in recognition. She acknowledged them with the smallest of nods. Nothing more. Her focus already on the sky ahead. The whispers would continue, long after she was airborne again. Long after her story became something told in fragments around briefing rooms and mess halls. The storm would fade from memory. The details of instruments and turbulence blurred with time, but the truth would remain. Respect was not demanded at the start. It was earned in silence afterward, when the sky itself bore witness. And that truth would linger, carried not in ceremony or inscription, but in whispers of a call sign that had once been laughed at and was now spoken with quiet reverence.